Most people imagine the end times as fire falling from the sky, nations collapsing, and the world descending into visible chaos. But when Jesus described the last days, his first warning wasn't about war. It wasn't about disasters. It wasn't even about persecution. It was deception. Take heed that no one deceives you. That was the warning. And he repeated it again and again and again. Because according to Jesus, the greatest danger in the final days wouldn't be obvious evil. It would be false light. Things that look true, feel true, sound spiritual, but slowly pull people away from reality without them ever noticing. And maybe that's what makes this warning so unsettling, because deception only works when you think you're too smart to be deceived. In the ancient world, deception was usually easy to recognize. False prophets wore strange robes. Cult leaders isolated themselves in deserts. Idols stood visibly in temples made of stone. But today, deception feels different. It streams into homes through glowing screens. It hides inside comforting messages. It disguises itself as self-improvement, spirituality, even truth itself. And there's one detail in Jesus' warning most people completely overlook. He never said deception would only affect evil people. He implied it could affect everyone, even believers, even sincere people. And later, this becomes incredibly important, because when we look closely at the words Jesus used and the world he was speaking into, an unsettling pattern begins to emerge, a pattern that feels strangely familiar today. The warning came during one of the most emotionally charged moments in the Bible. Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives overlooking Jerusalem. The temple still stood in all its glory. Massive white stones reflected sunlight like fire. Gold decorated the walls. To the Jewish people, it looked eternal, unshakable. But Jesus looked at that magnificent structure and calmly said it would all fall apart. Not one stone left upon another. The disciples were stunned because to them the destruction of the temple meant the collapse of the world itself. So they asked the question humanity has always asked, when will the end come? And Jesus answered with something unexpected. Not dates, not timelines, not secret calculations. Instead, he began with a psychological warning. Take heed that no one deceives you. At first, it almost feels too simple, but this is where the story becomes shocking, because the Greek word Jesus used for deception, planao, means more than simply believing something false. It means to wander, to drift, to slowly move off course without realizing it, like a ship quietly pulled away by unseen currents. And suddenly Jesus' warning feels deeply personal, because most people don't wake up one morning and consciously choose darkness. They drift there, one compromise at a time, one distraction at a time, one comforting illusion at a time. And history proves how dangerous that drift can become. The first century was filled with fear, political instability, economic anxiety, religious division, violence in the streets. People desperately wanted certainty, and whenever fear increases, deception becomes powerful. Because frightened people will often believe anyone who promises clarity. That's why false messiahs appeared constantly during that era. Some promised political revolution, others promised hidden spiritual knowledge, some claimed divine authority, and thousands followed them. Not because people were stupid, because people were desperate. That's the part modern audiences often miss. Deception rarely begins with rebellion. It usually begins with pain, loneliness, confusion, fear of the future. And maybe that's why Jesus warned about it so urgently, because he understood human psychology long before modern psychology existed. He knew anxious people become vulnerable people. And when people lose their inner anchor, they start reaching for anything that offers certainty, even illusions. But there's another layer hidden beneath this warning, one that becomes impossible to ignore once you see it. Jesus didn't just warn about obvious evil. In fact, the most dangerous deception in Scripture almost always appears beautiful at first. In the Garden of Eden, the serpent didn't begin with violence. It began with a question. Did God really say? A subtle distortion, a small crack in trust. And that pattern repeats throughout the entire Bible. Deception often sounds reasonable, comforting, empowering. That's why it spreads so effectively. And today, this pattern has become almost unavoidable. Modern culture constantly tells people to trust only themselves. Your feelings define reality. Your desires define truth. Your comfort matters most. At first, it sounds freeing, but over time, something strange happens. People become more anxious, more isolated, more spiritually exhausted, because humans were never designed to carry the weight of ultimate truth alone. And this is where Jesus' warning becomes painfully relevant. Spiritual deception isn't always about worshiping something obviously evil. Sometimes it's simply replacing truth with whatever feels easier. And that drift can happen slowly enough that nobody notices, not at first. One of the most haunting parts of Jesus' warning is this. He said deception in the last days would become so persuasive that, if possible, even the elect would be deceived. Think about that. Not weak people, not uninformed people, even the elect. At first, that seems terrifying, but hidden inside the warning is an important insight. Knowledge alone is not protection. Intelligence alone is not protection, because deception doesn't merely attack information, it attacks perception, and modern life may be the perfect environment for that kind of confusion. For the first time in history, humans are overwhelmed with endless voices competing for attention. Every opinion sounds urgent. Every headline feels catastrophic. Every platform rewards outrage. People are constantly consuming information, but understanding less, connected to everyone, while feeling emotionally disconnected inside. And maybe that's why discernment feels so rare now. Because discernment requires stillness, reflection, humility. But deception thrives in noise, and this is where Jesus' warning stops feeling ancient and starts feeling immediate. Most people think deception is intellectual, but biblically it's deeply emotional. That's why fear is so dangerous. Fear narrows perception. It makes people reactive, impulsive, easier to manipulate. And when fear dominates culture, people begin searching for saviors everywhere. Political saviors, technological saviors, spiritual saviors, anyone promising peace, anyone promising certainty, anyone promising control. But Jesus never promised his followers complete control over the future. He promised something different. Presence. Do not be afraid. That phrase appears throughout Scripture more than almost any other command, not because fear is uncommon, but because fear distorts vision, and distorted vision leads people into deception. This is why spiritual deception in the last days may not look like dramatic cults or obvious false prophets. It may look ordinary, a gradual numbing of the soul, a constant distraction from deeper truth, a world so noisy that people lose the ability to hear what actually matters. And maybe that's already happening. But there's one detail hidden in Jesus' warning that changes everything. He never told his followers to panic. He told them to stay awake. That distinction matters, because panic and awareness are opposites. Panic clouds judgment, awareness sharpens it. Throughout history, people obsessed with predicting the end often became consumed by fear, but Jesus repeatedly redirected attention away from obsession and toward readiness, watchfulness, faithfulness, inner stability. In other words, the antidote to deception isn't paranoia, it's clarity. And clarity usually grows in quiet places, not in outrage, not in endless arguments, not in fear-driven chaos, but in honesty, reflection, stillness, which may explain why modern distraction feels spiritually significant. Because distracted people are easier to influence, easier to manipulate, easier to drift. And perhaps the greatest deception of all is convincing people they are spiritually awake while slowly becoming emotionally numb inside. Maybe that's why this warning feels so personal today. Because millions of people are exhausted, mentally overwhelmed, emotionally anxious, spiritually disconnected. People scroll endlessly searching for meaning, but feel emptier afterward. They consume more information than any generation in history, yet struggle to know what's true. And beneath all the noise is a quiet fear many people never admit out loud. What if I'm losing myself? That question matters more than most realize, because spiritual deception rarely begins with dramatic rebellion. Sometimes it begins when people become too distracted to examine their own hearts, too exhausted to think deeply, too wounded to trust truth anymore. But Jesus' warning was never meant to produce hopelessness. It was meant to wake people up. Not into fear, into awareness. Because people who remain grounded in truth become harder to manipulate by fear, harder to control through outrage, harder to pull away from hope. And perhaps that's the deeper message hidden beneath this ancient warning, that in a world drowning in confusion, clarity becomes sacred. 2,000 years ago, Jesus looked at a frightened world and warned that deception would define the final days. Not obvious darkness, subtle distortion, the slow drifting of the human soul. And maybe that's why this warning still feels unsettling today, because every generation assumes deception happens to other people, other groups, other minds, other eras. But Jesus spoke as if the real battle would happen quietly, inside the human heart, in what people choose to trust, what they choose to fear, what they allow to shape their perception of reality. And perhaps the most important question is not whether deception exists, but whether we are willing to honestly examine the things influencing us every single day. Because sometimes the most dangerous lies are not the ones shouted loudly, but the ones whispered repeatedly until they feel normal. And maybe that's why this warning still matters, more than ever.